Our guests today are Dave Thomas, a partner of Wilson Sonsini out in Silicon Valley, a longtime contributor to my endeavors over the years, and a brilliant lawyer, and Magen, Director of Total Rewards for Murphy USA in Little Rock. I first met Magen at one of my conferences where a panelist didn't show up. I asked her to pinch hit, literally having just met her, and she did so with aplomb, a real pro. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. So Magen and Dave, thanks for joining us. The director's compensation table, so simple, but maybe not so simple, as we'll find out. We have a lot of questions for this one. I was surprised when I was putting the agenda together, so I'm very excited. So we're going to start with Magen talking about what Murphy USA does in terms of their board processes. Magen, who typically approves the director of compensation? Is it the full board, shareholders?
For my company, the full board of directors approves compensation. Shareholders do not do that. And of course, for our executives, it's executive comp committee, but it has to be the full board in all types of compensation for our directors, non-employee, specifically directors.
I find that I see director comp live in a few different places at my clients. It basically lives in, sort of originates in one of two places. Either the nominating governance committee leads with a proposal to the full board for changes, or the compensation committee will review and make a proposal to the full board. Almost always we have the full board do the actual approvals of changes to the director pay program. And in the current litigation environment we have these days, the plaintiffs bar real fired up about director pay. More and more companies are considering putting their director pay programs in front of shareholders for approval, although obviously it's a bit fraught with peril because of the possibility that if you put a program up and it's not approved, then you have a program that's out there and your shareholders have said they don't want it. So I don't think we have a trend yet towards actual pay programs, overwhelmingly being put to shareholder for approval, but people are leaning that way, especially as the case law is changing.
Thanks, Dave. So Magen, does Murphy USA hire an outside advisor for their compensation committee? I guess, does the compensation committee hire its own outside advisor, a comp consultant?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. For the same compensation consultant consults on our director compensation as well as our executive compensation as a service to our board. And so they're going out and looking at our peers, what our peers are compensating our directors, and they come with a recommendation, or at least with the market data, to allow the board to make a decision based on what our competitors are doing.
Yeah, I'm sure Dave remembers back before there was an actual table for this compensation, then some of this information wasn't easily gathered, so it was probably harder to do peer-to-peer comparisons, and I'm not sure the consultants, maybe they were in higher demand because they might have had their own private database about this kind of thing.
I agree with that. No, it's, I think mostly also, once again, I hate to always go back to litigation environment. I sound too much like a lawyer, but I think more companies are robustly disclosing their use of consultants in terms of how they're setting director pay as a prophylactic measure. I would describe it to some people essentially as the Central Park theory of how to do executive compensation or director compensation, which is the person who walks across the park with their head up and looks like they know what they're doing will not get mugged. And if you go out there with your head down and shuffle around like you don't know what you're doing, you're very likely to have somebody come up and try to take your wallet from you. And so I think that the plaintiff's bar will look and see companies that don't appear to be on their game with respect to their processes. And I think among the things that they look for are no discussion of whether peer groups are used or comp consultants are used. And so I think the more things you can do, like using a comp consultant, using peer reference data, it's safer for you from a litigation perspective.
So Magen, which directors actually get included in the table? There's, obviously some turnover on the board. How does that get handled?
Mm-hmm. At our company, we use our non-employee directors. We include those in the director compensation table. Our CEO our president and CEO is also a director. Of course, he shows up in the summary compensation table, so he is excluded from that. But even if we have partial year directors, they are also still included, and a prorated payment is reflected.
Yeah, and in the summary compensation table, those officers that are also directors, usually I think there's a footnote that breaks out how much of their compensation is for their director service. So what about what about directors who leave during the fiscal year or don't stand for re-election?
Yeah, no, you'd think that you'd be able to exclude folks who aren't standing for re-election, but the rules don't allow that. Essentially, if you're a director at any point during the year, you have to be in the table. We get asked the question sometimes like, hey, after the end of the fiscal year, we added a director. What do we do about them? I think the answer is they're not required to be in the table, but very often, just to show completeness, we'll put some narrative disclosure about how they're getting paid, just so we can have no one ask the question, did we forget?
So Dave, this is item 402K of Regulation SK. So this is, as a tabular format in the item itself. Let's talk about I guess it's the third and the fourth columns, the stock awards and options awards columns. The first one I should say, it's obviously the names of the directors. Obviously the second column is pretty easy. It's when the directors are getting paid in cash. What about these stock awards and option awards columns? Are they difficult?
Yeah, no, it's not difficult. And the reason why they're not difficult is you're using the same rules you use for the summary compensation table. And so you're using a grant date fair value concept for purposes of determining what numbers go in. The areas where we end up with trouble sometimes in the summary compensation table, sort of the weirdness around how you figure out numbers for performance-based equity awards. And generally speaking, directors aren't getting performance-based equity awards. If for some reason you had a repricing of a stock option during the year, the incremental fair value for the repricing would go in here in these columns. Another thing too, I think that's important to realize is much like with summary compensation, you've got a footnote how you actually arrive at your numbers. And then B, this is one that I see missed too regularly actually, is you're required to disclose in a footnote the aggregate awards outstanding, both options and stock awards at the end of the fiscal year. And so that's one that, if you do a good form check, you'll catch it. If you don't do a good form check, you'll miss it. And, it's a violation of the disclosure rules to not include it. I have some clients who don't want to muck up a footnote with a bunch of textual description of what's essentially numbers. And so what they'll do is they'll drop a second table that shows the outstanding awards at year end.
Good idea. What about column F here? The title of the column is actually a vestige of days gone by when some directors actually got a pension. That I don't think it happens at any company in the United States anymore. But what about the deferred comp?
Yeah, so deferred comp, we think about a few different ways. One is this column, which is very particularly talking about changes in the value. If you actually have a pension and there's an increase in pension value, there's rules and assumptions on how you're supposed to disclose the changes in pension value. Two, once again, similar to how you have it for the executive tables, if you have above market or preferential earnings on deferred compensation programs, those values go in here as well. Interestingly, if you have amounts that are, like, let's say you have a cash fee and you're permitted to defer it, it seems like you'd dump it in this column F, but the rules actually say that what you should do is a fee that's been deferred should go sort of in the original place that it exists. And so a cash fee you've chosen to defer doesn't go into column F. It would go into column B, which is fees earned or paid in cash. And once again, I tend to be a very principles-based disclosure person. I also tend to think that you can't ever go wrong by providing explanatory information. And so if I have amounts that are in the fees earned column that I know people have deferred, I always recommend let's just footnote and explain what happened. So anyone coming in to look at this will understand what we've done.
And then what about that catch-all column G, the all other compensation? What might fit in there?
It's really a grab bag, and there's a bunch of things that are specifically enumerated. One that comes up a lot is companies that have either charitable matching programs so that they'll match their directors' charitable contributions. There's something called legacy programs, which are essentially company contributions that's directed by a director. Interestingly, if you have directors who are serving in dual capacities, for example, I've got somebody who serves on the board as a non-employee director, but he's also acting as a scientific advisor, or maybe he's coaching the CEO. Outside of his board responsibilities, maybe he makes $50,000 or $100,000 a year in consulting arrangements during the year for other things. Those consulting fees would go into all other compensation. Other weird one too, not weird, it's non-standard is sometimes we'll have a top co-holding company, and so you've got a director who's the public company's up top, and so they're getting their fee for serving on the top holding company. They also have responsibilities at subsidiaries or subsidiary boards of directors, and so they're receiving fees from the company for serving on subsidiary boards as well. Those numbers would go into all other compensation. And then one which is often missed because it's not thought about is there are director perquisites. And so if you have directors who are using company aircraft for travel, or in some cases directors who are being provided personal security, or because they have a security risk associated with their service on the board, although very comfortable from a tax perspective in most cases that a bona fide security concern due to someone's service to a company, you can, generally speaking, not have an income inclusion for it. The SEC is very clear that despite the fact that the security concern arose from the business, despite the fact that the only reason why you're doing it is associated with the business, to the extent that you're providing security at somebody's personal residence or they're on personal travel, that should count as a perquisite. And so to the extent you have things like that would fall into the category of perquisites, plane travel, security, et cetera, those rules require disclosure. Here, there's a $10,000 de minimis threshold. So if all your perks total up to less than $10,000, you don't have to disclose. But once you hit $10,000, you've got to disclose everything.
Can you omit any of these columns if there's no amounts for any of the directors?
Yeah, you're allowed to. And so, you'll see sometimes companies, they'll have, essentially 3 columns, name, fees earned in cash, and stock awards. That's all that they do. I think the total, 4 columns, have to add the total in. So, but yeah, you can absolutely omit columns as long as nobody has amounts in them. You can't have, columns and then sort of one person's amounts are disclosed in a footnote. You want to be real upfront and open and clear about what you're doing. So if nobody has the amounts, you can omit it.
And the total column is pretty simple. You add up all these other columns and
math even a lawyer can do.
I'm sure people still botch it. So let's find, it's funny when I went through the 8K items to do vid guides for each of the 8K items, I found out about item 502F, which I had never had any experience with, which is if you don't know a fee amount as of the time you file a proxy, you're actually able to drop a footnote and say, we have an estimate, and then we'll file an 8K when we know what the final amount is. And I did find examples of companies doing that. I can't remember if any of them were in the director compensation arena.
Yeah,
but maybe.
I think that footnote you're supposed to drop says we can't figure it out. Here's an estimate. Here's when we think we'll have an answer. And then at the point where you actually do have an answer, you got that 502F disclosure, which actually I was thinking about that rule. That might be the only place where there's an 8K obligation associated with director pay. People often think, do I have to file an 8K when I change my director compensation policy? And the answer is no. Director compensation policy changes are a proxy disclosure item, and they're not an 8K item, which is an interesting quirk in the rules.
So Megan, let's talk about footnotes. This is the Murphy USA proxy for 2020. Groovy graphics here. And so you've got 5 footnotes. What typical things or do you want to talk to any of these footnotes? What typical things are footnoted in a director comp table?
Sure, I can definitely walk you through what we have. And I'm a big fan of still getting my hard copy proxy, so I have mine here in real color. In our footnotes for our director compensation table, we talk about how, as Dave mentioned before, we calculate the cash retainers, the stock awards, and what the value is used to calculate stock awards. We also talk about contributions made. That's in reference to all other compensation. Footnote 3 is about the exact gift matching contributions that were made on behalf of the directors. And we did make a note. We did have a director that retired during the year this was published for, and it was mid-year, and we just made a note of that for that specific director, which would represent generally a smaller amount of pay than the other directors received, and it's just a heads up as to why. In the last footnote, we talk about just kind of it was really just a quirky thing. It was a gift match made by a director in 2018, but we were provided with the receipt in 2019. So we paid for it during that time. So why it went over our gift match amount. That is what we disclosed.
And I think this is like a typical amount of footnotes for a director comp table. It doesn't get too lengthy like the summary comp table. But of course, it's going to depend on your own circumstances. The narrative here, the last paragraph, is about your matching gift program. That's a pretty common program that boards have.
Above that, just a little detail as well.
Oh, yeah.
On the compensation of our directors. It's really just meant to be, rather than a table, just an explanation of this is why they received the pay that they got, serving on various committees. We break that down for the annual retainers different committees get. We even mentioned the frequency of compensation for our directors, which is quarterly, and discuss the cash versus stock compensation. And then, as you pointed out below, detail about our gift match program.
Yeah, I mean, as director compensation has come under more scrutiny in recent years, you definitely start to see more and more narrative. Item 402K does have provisions in it to draw out narrative, and so I mean, you can always see something in addition to the table.
As you can see, it's much, much smaller than our CDNA for our officers.
Yeah, and the CDNA itself is obviously more full-blown disclosure, 20, 30 pages sometimes for the NEOs.
At this point, sometimes I kind of think about the proxy essentially as it's a supplement to the CDNA with the rest of the information about the company. So the CDNA drives the document. We get a little bit of other disclosure about how the company's doing.
So Dave, what are common areas where sometimes folks have trouble or might make mistakes when they're dealing with director compensation disclosure?
Yeah, so some of them I think are in the nature of form check mistakes, like I talked about. This is the idea of forgetting to include outstanding equity awards at year end. I think that we see sometimes issues with respect to directors who are providing ancillary services to the company and being paid for them, not being included or not being described in some detail. Get questions a lot about if somebody's going to elect stock instead of cash. How do we think about where that disclosure goes and what to do? And then one that I've seen a couple times, but not awfully regularly. Obviously, Magen was talking about the fact that if you have an NEO, a named executive officer who's also a director, essentially you refer out to the summary compensation table for that person's information. If you have somebody who is an employee but not an officer, who works for the company but also serves on the board of directors, the question is, how do you think about what of their pay should be disclosed? And so obviously they're not in the summary compensation table. They're not a named executive officer. They are a director. And so the question is, do you include all of their pay as an employee in the director compensation table? Do you say nothing in the director compensation table? And then you potentially have comps to report in the related party transactions area. And so, I tend to think that the best way to disclose this is the place people look for information about how directors are paid, which is the director compensation table. I think you could take a principled position that you don't have to put it in director comp for their employee compensation. I just think that if we're thinking about this as a document useful to stockholders and investors to read, putting the amounts you pay your directors and the area where they look for director pay is just the best place to put it because it's the most clean. So those are the ones I think that are sort of the strangest.
Yeah, normally the director's compensation's separate from the other executive pay disclosure. They might be up where you're talking about the election of the directors, that proposal. Yeah. So how much do investors care about this table?
I think sort of there's three different categories I think about when I think about, the broad category of investors. So one is there are the Glass Lewis's and ISS's of the world, not really investors, but investor advisors. In the last 2 years or 3 years, they really have shown a propensity to care a lot about how directors are paid as compared to what their peers are. They're really focused for the most part on, are you in the 95th percentile or higher, in which case we're going to bang on you a little bit and recommend against. They want to have clear disclosure about how you're paying your directors and how that's supposed to work. That's sort of category one. Category two is, the investors who have their own proxy research departments, their own governance departments who dig in this very well. I think obviously nobody wants to have directors that are overpaid, but I think any investors who are voting are going to want to have good, clear explanations of how you're paying your directors. And the last category is, the people who own one share so they can sue companies. And they care a lot about director pay disclosure because, they want to look and see, and they'll take 5 minutes to scan every proxy that's filed just to see if they can find a real outlier from a compensation perspective. And when they see big numbers on what directors are paid, they look to see, is there a description or explanation of how these numbers were determined, and is there enough information for me to think that a strike suit letter or demand letter to the company would be, fruitful for me to send to, protect the little sisters of the poor, from these excessive director pay, or alternatively to result in a decent settlement and fee. So I think the advent of plaintiff's litigation has led the plaintiff's bar to essentially read all proxies now to look for disclosure, and I think that's an area we have to focus on, unfortunately.
So Megan, where would you place the director's compensation table on the fund scale when you're compared to the other tables?
Gotta say, it's not my favorite table. My favorite table has got to be the summary compensation table, just because that's the first one I go to in any proxy. But it's pretty uncomplicated, pretty basic and simple to put together. So definitely one of the first that we conquer in proxy season.
It's a good break, actually. So if you're going through and you work on some of the ones that are harder for a while, it's like, you know what, I want an accomplishment before I take the weekend off. You can go bang out director comp real quick, be comfortable you've got it right, and then go ahead and relax over the weekend.
Exactly, and make sure, to Dave's point, that you've got the aggregate outstanding awards somewhere in a footnote or somewhere. I had to check and make sure we had checked that one off too.
Well, thank you very much.